All right. So we're going to start with lecture number 2, essentially going into the issue of why Latin America, what's the origin of the Latin American name, and why it's a unit that we happen to use today. So in that respect, we're going to explain how things come to be the way they are today. All right, Latin America is by definition something that come out by French geographers to try to put together all the nations that were using languages based in the Latin, Romance languages. So the idea really was produced by the French, in particular Michael Chevalier, or Michael Chevalier, talking about the race inhabiting the Latin America, and this is a variant of what used to be called the Latin Europe, instead of the Teutonic Europe, separating the two different places in Europe. But that concept is actually adopted much more in the Americas, Latin America in particular, than any other place. So the French actually are the ones that produce this particular Latin influence in the Americas. So the reference for that, if somebody wants to read it a little deeper in that, is addressed by Walter Mignolo in 2005. It's an article you can get into this particular book. The French were not really trying to do theoretical geography. They were trying to domain certain places in Europe, being left only with what is today Haiti. The French tried to increase their influence into Mexico, and they, in that respect, tried to establish a new kingdom in Latin America with Maximilian as Emperor of Mexico. And this guy was actually brought from Austria and tried to become a new emperor in Mexico, with obviously the resistance of the Mexican to the idea. So it was just a very short period of time that didn't work much. But the idea of Latin America as such is still working. In fact, Latin America can be subdivided into different regions. Spanish and Portuguese-speaking portions of South America in particular are places that sometimes are referred as Iberoamerica, because the Iberian Peninsula, Ibero-American, it's actually a term quite often used in South America as emphasizing the pertinence to the Iberian Peninsula that today is being Portugal and Spain. But in the north part, we have a part of South America, north part of South America, and in the Caribbean, we do have influence of the French, particularly in the Haitian Islands, in the Haiti country, which is part of the half of the Hispaniola Island. We do have a Dutch influence and English-speaking parts in the Caribbean and part of the North, Central, and South America. But the Ibero-American is a term that is still being used, especially in South America, obviously, including Mexico, of course. The boundaries of Latin America are well defined, essentially by oceans. In the west, the boundary is the Pacific Ocean. The few islands in Latin America that we can mention, Galapagos Island here, belongs to Ecuador. There's the Juan Fernandez Island, or Eastern Islands, belongs to Chile. Hard to see over here. I think it should be a little more west, about this area here. They're still part of Latin America because they do have influence from the Latin American countries. In this case, Ecuador, and then the other one in here is from Chile. Yeah. In the old days, something is worth mentioning for history is what happened with the Philippines. The Philippines was for a long time a colony of Spain. And in fact, the Philippines depends of the New Spain viceroy, which was in Mexico. So Mexico and the Philippines were quite related in that particular time. So Pacific in the west. In the south, well, obviously in the south we have the boundary with the Antarctic Peninsula, which happens to be in this area here, a little further south, obviously. But the Drake Passage, this area here, is essentially the boundary with Latin America. Yeah. Cape Horn is in the southern border of Latin America. In reality, it's not really a part of the continent, it's an island. The name is the island Hornos in Spanish. Hornos means a place where you make a fire. The original name, Cape Horn, is also a bad translation of a name that was produced by the sailors from Holland that call it Horn with two N's. But you know, maps and names are not always changing due to mistranslations. Antarctica, in fact, is claimed in part by Chile, Argentina, Brazil. All of them claim a piece, but there's nobody really having a full sovereignty on those places. And in the east, obviously, in the east we have the Atlantic Ocean, but it's a bunch of different islands in possession of the British. In particular, this set of islands here, Malvinas for Argentinians, Falkland for the British. Those were involved in a recent war, and now they are in possession of the British. Then we have a few other islands in here in the Central Atlantic, very much following the Central Mid-Atlantic Range, including Tristan da Cunha, St. Helena, and Ascension. Those islands are essentially volcanoes in the central part of the Atlantic, and they only have some value for strategic purposes. And in the north, that's probably one of the most discussed boundaries, because it happens to be many of the islands in the Caribbean are really speaking English. So, you know, you see Jamaica here, some of the islands in the Caribbean, in the Lesser Antilles, are in possession of the British Commonwealth, and also some of the part of the Dutch possessions. And Bahamas, north of Cuba, is also English speaking, and in fact, they kind of be excluded from the concept of Latin America as a place where the Romance languages are spoken. In that respect, also, the border with Latin America in the south of the United States is kind of difficult to define, because the language is pervasive in the south of the United States. Many of the population speak Spanish, so it's hard to put a language as a definition of a country, as a region. But in fact, we're going to use the U.S. south border as the boundary of Latin America for this course. In any case, that can be discussed, and define again if somebody wants to. But Florida, in that respect, Texas, even Louisiana, Texas, California, and so used to be all possessions of the piece of royalty of a New Spain, which is Mexico now. So Latin America is defined like we see in this map. It's a big large extension. It goes from 55 latitude south over here all the way to the north, in the equatorial line, and crossing the Cancer Capricorn in 23 degrees north, and reaching about to 33 degrees north, depending where we are. We have all kinds of elevation in here, including all what happened in the northern and central part of South America with the Andes. You go to in excess of 4,000 meters, all the way to very shallow areas where we see the central area of the Amazon basin happen to be quite shallow. So it's no more than 300 or 400 meters at the most in the whole Amazon basin. An ocean liner can actually sail all the way to Manaus, which is in the center of the continent. So regions of Latin America, there are many, and one of them, interesting one because historically is the place where the Western Europeans arrived first, is the West Indies. In fact, the name is a misnomer because the Indies, the original Indies, was what we know today as the Indian areas in Southeast Asia, and the West Indies are later defined as the Caribbean. So we have in here 4 different big regions. We're going to talk about this in another lecture when we talk about the Antilles in general. That's another name. Greater Antilles, which are the larger islands in order: Cuba, Dominican, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and then the Lesser Antilles, number 3, which are a bunch of islands in different sizes, all of them in the volcanic arc produced by subduction in this area here. So all these tend to have volcanic activity any given time. Actually, there are all them in historical records. And the Greater Antilles are not affected by volcanoes, but greatly affected by seismic events. And then the last number in here, number 4, the continental islands are essentially fragments of the tectonic activity between South America and the Caribbean plate moving sideways in here and producing these fragments, which are continental crust. But we're going to talk about this much more later. Now, Latin America is defined by culture. And it's actually a mixed culture of Europe, Asia, Africa, and the natives that were there. It was a place where we have interesting empires and civilizations. Cultural contributions, probably essentially a whole bunch of new crops. And it seems to be rather difficult to find out that before the America discovery, we didn't have corn, potatoes, sweet potatoes, manioc beans, tomatoes, peanuts, and some other things. Chocolate, for example, too. Tobacco, quinine, all those things were unknown before the Europeans arrived. Obviously, you got a big number of Native American groups in the world. It's the place where we have all of them. And it's the place where we have the largest concentration of people speaking Romance languages, hence Latin America, Latin derived languages. So we have Portuguese, Spanish, the main one, followed by Portuguese, French, and that's about it. Religion, the largest concentration of Catholics, largest concentration of Christians too. But interestingly enough, also got the largest concentration of Africans outside Africa, and Japanese outside Japan. So it's a place of migration too. This is something that marked the subdivision of Latin America in the very beginning, when the new America was essentially divided by the by the Pope in two different places. Well, not really Latin America. The whole country, the whole world was divided in two. This part in here, in this direction for Portugal, and the other part in this direction for Spain. Obviously, you see here, the other countries didn't actually have any say in that. In part because Spain, in that part, in that time, was actually involved in most of the eastern part of Europe, including Italy, part of France, and even Germany was included in what used to be Spain in that time. So that's the whole reason. So because of that treaty, Brazil is part of Portugal, influence as all Africa, all the way into India and such, was part of the territory conceded to the Portuguese, and all the others were conceded to Spain. So Spaniards were the first to colonize the region, and they were looking for gold first, eventually finding more silver that happened to be equivalent in richness. So they developed in a very important economy based in mining and essentially collecting as much as they can of that gold. The Brazilians actually did have a different environment. The Portuguese occupied this territory here. Were not really much wealth in mining or gold and silver, so they start using more the land to produce crops. So Latin America in 1650 is, like we see here, the Treaty of Tordesillas, marked by this lining here. All this is Brazil. In Brazil always tend to be a little more expansive than it was. So it was going west all the time, still going west in part. And the rest of it was essentially part of Spain domains, divided in several viceroyalties. The north part in here is what is called the New Spain. Viceroyalty of Peru is all the rest, essentially including everything in South America, from the Panama Strait all the way south. By the 1830, the countries start seeking independence, and we see here Mexico, 1821, the South with Argentina, 1816, independence. In Peru, shortly after, Bolivia, 21, 25, Chile, and so on. So independence of countries were happening as the Spaniard empire vanished. So, but one of the main things that happened in Latin America and the culture of Latin America is what is called the Columbian exchange. You see here in this map the arrows going into the western hemisphere were representing what was moving, species, crops, different kinds of foods, and coming from the west to the east, we see colonist, animals, particularly animals, cattle, all kinds of domestic animals, horses and sheep and cows. All the things were non-existent in Latin America. They didn't have domestic animals. So all that thing was coming. Not really something to be proud of, but also slaves were coming as a cheap labor from Africa. In particular, here we see going into the Caribbean, but also going into Brazil, and then later coming into the 13 colonies. We see disease also, an important factor that we're going to see influence Latin America greatly in a moment. But in fact, what we see here, change was deep and permanent. So the Columbian Exchange is the name that receives all this interchange of things. And we see here specie, which is another name for coins, gold and silver, crops and food, colonists, people coming to work and to own land, animals, particularly domestic animals, all kinds of farm animals like cows, sheep, and all that, chickens. Chickens were one of the first to be spread in between the Incas. Um, and then plants coming from Spain, like obviously wheat and some other crops like um, uh, vines for producing wine and all that. And then unfortunately there's some other things coming too. We have weeds coming, disease, which is a very important factor later in the history, and slaves. The moving of people coming from West Africa into the Americas was quick and massive. And in fact, after this, the two sides were changing forever by all these factors. A good book to talk about it, and we're gonna change this a little bit. Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond, talking a very easy way about all these things. So we have essentially talking about crops. We have new crops coming to the continent. In particular, wheat. That was one of the main things to use in planting areas that were temperate in climate, like the pampas in the South Central America and in the plains of Brazil. Then we have grapes, sugarcane, a dominant cash crop for the Brazilian and Caribbean. A lot of labor is involved in the production of sugarcane. Obviously, that's one of the reasons why so many slaves were brought over. Coffee was also later very much established as a dominant crop in highlands in the Central America and Venezuela and Brazil. And many others were transported to the whole world from here. Corn, in particular, potatoes, which were exclusive in Central and South America, hot peppers, tomatoes, pineapple, cacao, and many other things. Now, disease. It's been established that the native population of Latin America were massively affected by the old world diseases. The numbers are actually talking about 50 to 90% of the native populations dying in a fairly short time. Were no resistance, so they die quickly. As a record, there are about 50 epidemics in the Valley of Mexico in the interval of about 300, 400 years. Mainly smallpox, measles, whooping cough, the bubonic plague too, diphtheria, influenza, and any other disease you can imagine. Domestic animals were also changing the landscape in a big way. Importantly is to mention there were no large mammals in Middle America in particular. In South America, in the Andean region, they have llamas and they use it as domestic animals for milk, food, meat, and also for cargo. But they are limited in many ways. So in the Latin America, didn't have, the Americas in general, didn't have any large and domestic animals that were available to the native population. So the Europeans brought horses, pigs, sheep, goats, cattle, all kinds of cattle, and obviously pests like rats that contribute to the spreading of the disease. All these new group of domestic animals were producing an important change in the native cultures. The plains, the Indians living in the plains were quickly adapting to use horses in the short time they have left until they become essentially no longer free. The other thing is when you have domestic animals, you tend to corral them by fences, and that is actually partition the land, something that the Native Americans were not really used. So, you know, the concept of property of the land is not something they were accustomed to deal with. So for them to see something like this was a really important shock. The other thing is, no cultures in Latin America got an extensive use of the writing, so they couldn't actually make knowledge be transmitted quickly from one to the other. The use of metallic tools, iron tools in particular, in fact, obsidian or stone tools were the majority of the tools the Native Americans used. Even the most advanced ones did have only a limited knowledge, no more than the Bronze Age. But for effective terms, they were all in the Stone Age. And that's a big difference. Farming equipment. Agriculture practices were much more efficient and fast. The use of the wheel to move things around. Guns and gunpowder, that thing terrified essentially all the native populations. And the change of the land by fencing in particular. New institutions, church, the government, all those things were new. Property. The towns relocated Indians from the land into places, and so they were compelled to work. In places, they got a system called encomienda. The system was giving a particular group of natives to be in charge of a particular government official, and he make them work and make a profit of it, big time. The religion was imposed too, obviously, Catholic. And new people. Important enough, we see here the African slaves, they were moved to Brazil. It's about 3.6 million estimated, obviously. About 9 times the number that the colonies, the British colonies were getting. So when we talk about slavery and the responsibility of the 13 colonies, it's just a chapter on the whole thing. So Spanish and Portuguese were the main colonizers of Middle and South America. African slaves were going particularly to Brazil and the Caribbean, in particular to work in the sugarcane cultivation. British were coming too in some places, Irish, French, Germans, and some Asians and Indians from India, in particular to Trinidad. And here is an island where we have a big, large number of members of the Indian subcontinent. You happen to be interested in this is a set of videos produced by Professor Gates. He's a very interesting character, and he did a series of documentaries about the blacks in Latin America. Because, you know, from the perspective of USA, seems to be this is the only place where we have blacks. No, it's not true. In particular, Brazil is very abundant in component of African into their populations. Right? We see here some numbers. 450,000 came to the United States, and in the whole number was 11.2 million Africans out of Africa. So That's essentially most of it happens in Latin America. There's a link in here if you can actually access those things in PBS. Quite interesting, I recommend it. And then obviously blending happens. The African American people and their culture mix with the Native Americans, mix with the whites, and then have an interesting blending set of cultures. Particularly in places like Brazil, we see big areas where they celebrate the mix of the two cultures, in particular with celebrations with roots in Africa and roots in the Western culture, particularly from Spain or Brazil. Many places, most of the population is what we call mestizo people. Something that should be emphasized is blancos or whites are still today overrepresented in the elite class. Most of the government is in the hands of this particular elite class. Religion, obviously, the majority of the population in Latin America goes with Catholicism, but it's a big part of what we call syncretic religions, which happen to include some of the original beliefs from Africa and from the natives into the Catholic faith. So we see this happen in the north, Bolivia and Peru. It happens also in Brazil. Brazil, more than anything, with the African population, and in Bolivia, Peru, with the Native Americans. So it's an interesting assimilation of the two religions in one, and then producing some interesting cultural factors. Again, some numbers in here. What is called syncretic is when we have this kind of hybrid religions. So we have the Santeria, Lucumi in Cuba, Voodoo, Haiti, obviously, all the movies that have been done about it. Candomblé in Brazil, over 1 million. Another one in Brazil, Umbanda, is about 30 million, important terms. So the two Candomblé and Umbanda can actually be called Macumba. All those names are what they call themselves. So what we see here is a major influence of the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal and Spain. About 1/3 of the population speak Portuguese, and the other 2/3 Spanish. There are many native languages still spoken in some remote places. Most of them are Catholics. And we see here a map with all the languages. See, these are Latin American, including all the languages. Well, it's difficult to include all the languages. As you see here are many languages. Some of them are being confined to some remote place, like this one in here, in the middle of the jungle, or in the central part of the Amazon. All those different languages essentially obey more than anything to isolation. If you have influence with a predominant Spanish and Portuguese, we happen to be Portuguese here, Spanish in this clear color in here, is encroaching and isolating all those languages and changing them, obviously. So, you know, a language is dead when nobody is speaking it anymore. So, the legacy of this colonialism is that all the Spanish colonies were focusing gold and silver, and essentially were extractive and taking them to Spain. Not always, because sometimes instead of Spain they were moved to Manila in the Philippines, and then used to buy other things and then send it back to Spain. So it's an interesting movement of this richness of Central and South America. The Portuguese they were essentially devoted to agriculture, more than anything, sugarcane. So, by the beginning of the 19th century, most of the countries were seeking independence, and the division of Latin America into viceroyalties, New Spain and Peru, and then Brazil, happened to be affected by problems in Spain, and it happened gradually as they were taking their own destiny in that particular time. Population today, we see the Latin America is about 500 million people. Most of them are living in Brazil and Mexico. Fertility rate, that used to be a very worrisome factor in Latin America, went from 6 children per woman in the 60s to about 3 in the 2000s. This is in average in Latin America. So population is becoming more stable. The other thing that happens quite interestingly, 3/4 of the population lives in the cities. We do have mega cities like Mexico City, Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, Buenos Aires, where the population is larger than any other place in the country. Here we have a map with that. See, this particular symbol here is representing very large cities, more than 5 million. And interestingly enough, in this area here, we see most of the cities are in the coastal area, and in this area here, most of the large cities happen to be in the central high area where the climate is better. So the interior of South America we see here in this aerial satellite imagine is empty. Here is empty. So the central part of South America is almost unpopulated. In Central America, most of the people live in high areas because the climate, the temperature is better. And only in the south part, the temperature is such that we can still live in coastal areas. Major cities, Sao Paulo, is called a primate city, not because it's full of monkeys, but it's because it's 3 or 4 times larger than the second largest city in the country. That's the definition. And we have many of those. Sao Paulo is one, Mexico City is another one, Lima, Caracas, Buenos Aires too. Living in rural areas is common. It happens everywhere in the world, so even more in Latin America. We do have in this region also a recent European migration. From 1970 to 1930, we have 80 million immigrants, most of them coming from Italy, Portugal, Spain, into Latin America. But most of them were to the southern part of Latin America due to climatic reasons. The climate is much similar in the southern part of South America than in the central northern part of South America. We have a very important Asian migration from China and Japan first. Many came to work in coffee plantations, big working places like mines and such. And that's about it. We're going to finish in here. As you see, Latin America is not really a place where migrants are coming out of it, but also a place where it used to be a place where are receiving immigrants too, especially during the early part of the 19th century. Anyway. So, next time we're going to talk about physiography of Latin America. A little more about the geography and the different features we can observe in Latin America. All right, thank you very much.